There's no movement like the Swinging Bridge in Cottage Grove. It's been right here for over 107 years. 4 versions right on this spot. One more before then. The man that built the first one, James Knox Polk Currin, was of the Pioneer Currin family. He was a postmaster, a druggist, a businessman, a politician, and an educator. The Currins left an indelible mark on Cottage Grove. This month's History Pub, sponsored by the Cottage Grove Genealogical Society in downtown Cottage Grove, is entitled The Currin Family, A Bridge to the Past. I want to give a big shout out to all the folks that helped put together providing photos and information for this talk: Deborah Monsiv, Alice Christensen, Lloyd Williams, Joanne Skelton, Susan Sinclair Christian, Monty Huntsman, Ryan Sisson, the city engineer at the time the current bridge was rebuilt, that lovingly guided that process through. The city of Cottage Grove, the city recorder Mindy Roberts, who took me down to the vault multiple times to examine records. Friends of the Swinging Bridge, from the get-go, you made it happen. And the citizens of Cottage Grove that rounded up your water bills and supported us every step of the way. Thank you all. It's great to see so many friends and friendly faces. It's a real excitement to be able to talk to you about my favorite subject, the Swinging Bridge. Like the introduction said, we live just very close to the Swinging Bridge, and it was quite a shock when we went down one day and it was boarded up. And I what? And so I went right straight to City Hall and said, what's going on? And they go, well, it's unsafe. And so I go, well, what's the plan? And they go, what do you mean, what's the plan? I go, to fix it. And they didn't really seem to have a coherent answer. So the birth of the Friends of the Swinging Bridge followed soon after. It really was nothing more than a Facebook page, a Facebook group, and a few meetings, and I see a lot of the original Friends of the Swinging Bridge here today. So thanks for all you did to help make it happen. So the Currins, this is Louisa County. This is Granville County in North Carolina. But this is really ground zero for the Currins. Tazewell County. Tazewell County is right in the Appalachian region, and I looked them up, and it's the town that they were most connected with is Galax, and they have a huge string convention, a fiddlers convention that started there in 1935. And so this is really Appalachia, but the Currins were kind of restless. They didn't like to stay anywhere too long, and so they started heading west. So Robert Currin, he was in Virginia. These are the 2 families we're going to be following, George Currin and Waddy Currin. And that gives us the 2 branches that ended up in Cottage Grove. So we're going to take care of George Currin first, get him out of the way. George Washington Currin, and he married Martha Swift. Her dad was named Flowers Smith, which I thought was pretty cool. He died and was buried in Galax, Virginia. And in that old cemetery there, he had a huge chunk of land, and he had all of these children. A lot of them, they all went to Missouri at one time, but some of them kept going west. And there's a group that ended up in Currinsville, which we'll hear more about. And 3 of the children from George ended up in Cottage Grove. Christiana, who married a Cooley, and John Currin and William Currin both of these got donation land claims. So in 1850, when they got here, you could claim half a section, 320 acres, if you would improve it for free. All you had to do is improve it, and you got half a section, half a square mile of land. The Coolies I'll tell you more about a little later, but they also got a land claim, but they were here later, and they only got 120 acres, 160 acres. So a quarter of a section. And so, but they were also a Currin. She was a child of George Currin. So this is the family home in Galax. This is where Major George put down his stake, and all those kids were born. And when they moved west, they sold it to their brother-in-law, one of the Roberts. One of the Roberts married one of the girls, and they headed west. So I don't know if the house is still standing, but that was the family home. And when they got to Missouri, they didn't like it. They found the conditions were bad. They said they was not satisfied. There was sickness, much sickness in the area, especially chill and fever, and they were determined not to stay. Some of them went back to Virginia. They were going to go to Texas, but a letter crossed paths of Hugh and George Currin praising the Oregon Territory, so they decided to head for Oregon. And they ended up near Estacada and founded a town called Currinsville. It's no longer there, but the cemetery is the Currin Cemetery. So here's some pictures of Currinsville. This was the home of Robert Currin. This is Hugh and Diona's farm. Notice all the dray animals. This was the Currinville General Store that Hugh and George operated. And here is the Currinville Cemetery, where there's still some Currins lingering. All right, so like I said, some of those Major George kids ended up in Cottage Grove. So this is John Currin's claim on the Row River, and there's the Sears claim. The Sears wagon train got here. There's the Ogilbys, Mosbys. So some of the real famous Cottage Grove settlers were gathered here. This is William Currin's land claim. Just kind of some landmarks. Goddard Lane is about here. And of course, here's the freeway going through. Taylor Butte Road. So that's William's claim. And the Coolies, again, I will tell you a little more about the Coolies later, but that is also really a Currin claim, because that was Krishana Currin married a Coolie, and there's some funny stuff going on with the Coolie, that marriage. But the son made the claim. However, he ended up mostly in Brownsville. So, but anyway, more details on that in a minute. So this is John Currin and his wife, Margaret Swift. They got that claim near Row River. And, and these times were hard. They lost 3 children in the matter of a month. This is from the 1863 Oregon Statesman paper. It says Luvidia, but it's Lavinia. Notice they measured life in years, months, and days, because it often came down to that. But diphtheria is what they called it. They called putrid sore throat, but a highly contagious disease. It's both an infection and a toxin. It was very deadly in the 1800s, and it was common to lose multiple children. David Mosby, for instance, lost 4 children within a month to diphtheria. And the pattern is one child dies, and about a week later, the next child dies, and the next child dies. So it's hard times back in the day. So they lost 3 children right away. And it's a sad but true thing. So we really like to understand that medicine is a good thing, especially the vaccines that prevent diphtheria. So we got some confusion in Cottage Grove, and this played out when we were finished up with the Swinging Bridge. What do you call it? This is the Currin covered bridge, and it's named because it was near the John Currin's land claim. It's the only one that's 2 colors in Oregon, red sides and white front. The original one was built in 1885, I believe. And it was replaced, the one currently there was replaced in 1925. It was at that time there was competing bids for companies to build bridges, and they got a bid for $6,000, and they said, wait a minute, we can build it cheaper than that. So then the Lane County started building a lot of the covered bridges themselves. So it was again named for the John Currin claim. And this picture shows Jerry Rust with his son in front of the Currin Bridge. And Jerry did a lot to save what covered bridges we have. They were getting to the point where they said, let's scrap them. And Jerry says, no, let's not. Hey, Trevor. So, Jerry, are you in the house or are you in your Zoom meeting? Okay, well, I told him he was going to be in the show, so Jerry's actually here, so maybe we'll see him later. But he did so much to save the area's covered bridges in Lane County when they were just going to tear them down and get rid of them because they weren't load worthy, and they would have cost more. But he recognized the value of them and did a lot to save them. So the Currin Bridge is still standing thanks to Jerry. There was also a Currin Railroad Bridge, and if you've ever been on the bike trail, that's the metal bridge right by the Dorena Grange. It was wooden, and this was built in 1903. And on 1909, the OS&E, the old Slow and Easy, Oregon Southern and Eastern, crashed. There were no fatalities, but there were a lot of broken bones. And you can see there's the locomotive hanging on, and their cars are all in here, and it was a heck of a mess. That wasn't the only time it collapsed. It also collapsed in 1924. So that's the 2 Currin bridges that aren't connected to our swinging bridge. This is William Currin, who also had a land claim. He never married. He was an old bachelor. And I love this in his obituary. He was always as good, his word was always as good as his note. So he was very well respected. It says he has no political aspirations, so he always allied with the Democratic Party. And so it means quite a bit different today. And I'll get that a little bit later when we talk about JP and politics. Democratic Party in that time was mostly the Southerners. So that was the people that were not unionists. They were generally pro-slavery, pro-Southern, pro-states' rights. And as they left the South and headed west, they carried those values with them. I grew up in the South, and we were always Democratic. We never had any Republican. A Republican didn't stand a chance in the South. It was a Democratic thing, but it means so much different today. Now the Democrats are the next thing to socialists or whatever, but back in the day they were people like George Wallace and all kind of stuff, the Dixiecrats and everything. So anyway, we'll talk about more about what a Democratic means, but the Currins were Southerners by extraction, and they were staunch Democrats in the turn of the century terms. All right, now we get to talk about the Cooleys a little bit. So in this picture, the family group of Cooleys, on the far left is Currin Cooley, so a little nod to his family roots. And then there's George. Alexander is the son of the Currin daughter from George, Christiana. And then there's Robert and Judah, who married a white. And this is Christiana's tombstone in Shield Cemetery. I never found a picture of her, but she married Martin Cooley back in Virginia. They went to Missouri. He left on a cattle drive and never returned. So they were farming in Missouri. He left on a cattle drive and they never returned. As I did the history, she considered herself a widow, even though there was no record of his death. And I saw a lot of different versions of why he never came back. And it seemed like it might have been a case of he was like, I'm out of here, you know. So anyway, there's no record, and a lot of the genealogy stuff of him, they just kind of wrote him off. So it's not like that they were grieving over poor Martin, who got attacked by savages on the cattle drive or whatever. They were just kind of like, yeah, he's done. So anyway, his brother George got a land claim and went to Brownsville and was clerking in a store which he eventually bought and owned, and was a prominent citizen in Brownsville. But he made sure he sent money back to support the claim so that his family had a place to live. And that was just north of William's claim. They abut against each other. So when you say Cooleys in Cottage Grove, they're really Currins as well. All right, so that was the George side of the Currins. So now we're going to talk about the Waddy or the Wadsworth side of the Currins. There's Wadsworth and his wife. Oh, Martha went. Sorry, typo. I just saw. This is they were Virginians, and their children. Notice Hugh again, and John Wadsworth Currin ended up in Cottage Grove. Lynch stayed put in Missouri. James Knox Pope, the middle child, that's our boy. He ended up in Cottage Grove. Missouri, Lucy, Clifford, Missouri, and Robert stayed in Missouri. So both of these brothers, Waddy and George, were in the War of 1812. Waddy was a private and George was a major, so they did get some pensions for that. And Reverend Hugh ended up serving in the Confederate Army through his association with Missouri. Missouri was one of those states where you always talk about brother against brother. Well, that was Missouri. So this is the earliest picture I found of James Pope Currin and his brother Clifford. So this is JP. And here's his signature, and when he was serving as Secretary Pro Tem of the City Council in 1895 for Cottage Grove. He also was the treasurer of Cottage Grove. So he did have a civic side, which I'll cover in more detail. But I didn't know exactly where to just fit this picture in, so I stuck it right there. So how did he get the name James Knox Polk Currin? Well, he was born in 1845, and that was the same year as President Polk. And his name, of course, was James Knox Polk. He was kind of an odd bird in politics. He was called the dark horse candidate because in that year it was the Whigs and I can't remember which all parties, but there was no clear candidate, and he kind of came out of nowhere and was elected president. He did a lot to expand the territory of the United States. It was under his watch when they had the Texas annexation and the war with Mexico and the Oregon Territory, most importantly. You may remember the phrase 54-40 or fight, because the Oregon Territory was claimed, it went all the way up into Canada, and it was claimed both by the British and the United States. The British trappers through the Hudson Bay Company were coming down into Oregon, and so it was contested territory, and President Polk stood up to the British and risked war to claim the continental destiny. So ultimately, it allowed James Polk Currin to settle in Oregon based on this president. He was considered the last strong president before things started falling apart in the lead up to the Civil War. So there's a little bit of mystery. I wasn't able to dial down everything, but Waddy, it seems, went to Missouri, married somebody, but there's no real record of her birth or death. And then he came back to Virginia, married a Wynn, and that's where he had all his kids, but they ended up back in Missouri again. So I'm really not sure about all that. I didn't have time to run all that down, but it seems like that at least JP was in Missouri from 1852 until 1867. And he did go back there to help his ailing parents and was teaching school there when his mother died in 1873. He did come back to Oregon, though, and back to Cottage Grove. So this gives you kind of I call him a Renaissance man. He did a lot of things. He was an educated person. He was a man of letters. These are some of the many things that he did. He was an educator, a surveyor, a postmaster, a druggist, a businessman, a church elder, a civic leader, and an engineer. So I'm going to touch on each of those phases of his life. He's the one that we've named the bridge after, and we'll get to the reason why. How many beavers do we got in the room? All right, a few brave souls. Well, you're looking at the original class of what became Oregon State University. 2 out of the 3 are Cottage Grovers. This is Robert McCrary Veach, and this is James Knox Polk Currin, and this is Alice Biddle. These are both in their 20s, these guys, almost into their 30s. She was just 16. She had a perfect attendance and straight A student, and she ended up marrying her professor. And ended up down in California somewhere. But anyway, it was kind of, in that time, Oregon was pretty egalitarian. They gave the suffrage to women far ahead of the rest of the country. So this school started, what became Oregon State University, went back to the Corvallis Academy. It was associated with the AME Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, South, and they began offering a 4-year degree program in 1868. the two guys from Cottage Grove got scholarships through the state to promote agricultural science, and they were in the first class in 1870. So we're proud that the first beavers were Grovers. So education was a big part of his life. He married a teacher, Amelia Perkins. They were early pioneers, came in a wagon train. She was teaching in Latham in 1867, I believe, and they were both teachers. They moved to Cresswell after they got married. That's where their daughter Lula was born. She became a teacher, and so education was a big part. When he went back to Missouri to take care of his parents, he was teaching. He also served on the school board, the school officers, as clerk. And that's a big part of his life. So I'm going to kind of make a segue in just to early schools, because that will kind of tie that education piece together. This is the first graduating class of Cottage Grove High School in 1896. You got some Lurches, you got some Macreadys, you got some Veaches, you got some Knoxes. And this is their daughter Lula. Here they are again. These are all cousins. This is Lula Currin. This is Judah Cooley, who we saw as a white, and this is Ermine Veach. She's the daughter of Robert M. Veach, which we'll hear more about as well. Here's some more things of Lula. She went to U of O, graduated in the class of 1904. There's her graduation picture. She got a job with Cottage Grove High School in 1906 and worked for 30 years until her retirement. So here's just some pictures of her through her career, 1912, 1921, 1930. And this I love. This was the annual from 1913, the seniors getting the boot. And there's their diploma being thrown after them. So there was humor that was alive and well in those times. She also served on the library board for a number of years, for decades. Lula Currin. She mostly taught, Latin was the consistency. They have her here, Latin, English, and bookkeeping, but history was mentioned a lot in the old annuals, both U.S. and world history. So this is some of the early schools of Cottage Grove that were actually in the schools. Most of the early schools in Cottage Grove were outside of the city. The first one was the Currin School near the land claim. Latham was another early school. This was the first city school, and it sits on the lot where our house is today, 2nd and Adams. So it served from 1876 to 1890. It was a 2-floor open room. These were just one big room, and that was they taught all the grades. Mostly when you were big enough to walk behind a plow, your education was done. So they didn't really go much to high school. They realized in late 1880s, they realized this was no longer adequate, and that was when JP was on the school board, and they said we need a bigger building. So this was the second school in Cottage Grove, the East Side School, and it had all the grades, including high school. This was the old high school, and you can see right here is the cupola of the old school before it was torn down. So this served as the high school, and later became Jefferson School, because by then they had the West Side School built and other schools. Outside of Cottage Grove were all separate school districts. That's another whole story to tell. So a lot of mention was made about the Swinging Bridge being a pathway for school kids. So Madison Avenue, here's where all those schools were that I showed you, at Adams and Fifth. And it was a natural pathway for kids going to school to go across the Swinging Bridge. So a lot of kids ended up using the Swinging Bridge, as did many other residents. This is another Currin associated with the schools, George Currin. He was son of Felix Currin, which was John Currin's son. So this was the John Currin side, the George Currin side. But he was beloved by the student body and the administration. He was, can I get some water? Water? Thanks. They named the school football field after him, the Currin Field, in his lifetime. It was a living memorial. And he was a mentor to the school. The principal at the time that he passed said that he was never too busy to lend a helping hand. Thank you, Ruth. Much better. So, even though he was, quote unquote, a custodian, he was every kid's friend, and he was his school in the truest sense of the world. So he was very much beloved, and when they moved the high school, of course, the Currin Field, I don't think they call it Currin Field anymore. That got left behind, but he was very well honored in his day. Okay, one of the next aspects of Currin that I want to talk to you about, James Polk Currin, was that he was a surveyor. Here in one of the early elections, the Democratic ticket, for Lane County, he ran for county surveyor. And there is Robert M. Veach was running for clerk on the Democratic ticket. Here is the city directory for 1910, and he's listed his occupation as surveyor. And in the city council minutes, when the Pacific Highway was constantly being rerouted, Highway 99 was constantly being rerouted through Cottage Grove, they ordered that he would be to assist the state engineer in locating the route for that highway through the city. And these are the city minutes from 1920. Just some various clippings from the paper, and I really have to sing the praises for the U of O historic newspaper collection. It's a searchable feature where you can look through by newspaper, by city, by date, by subject, and you find out so many interesting things. A lot of times what I was looking for wasn't what I found. So anyway, here he's talking when he was also a druggist. He said that he's turning his store over to an apprentice because he has a survey contract. He was leaving for Eastern Oregon for a surveying contract, and that was with the Umatilla Indian Reservation that he was surveying out there in Eastern Oregon. And this little piece, Mr. J.P. Currin was out surveying for Mr. R.H. Hazelton on Monday. And in his obituary, he followed surveying more or less throughout his life, being in the employment of the government for some time. His son Hugh was also following his father's footsteps as a surveyor. The next aspect of his life I want to talk about is postmaster. And in those days, postmaster was curator of the letterbox. So it's not like you had a post office. You had the letterbox in your house or your office or wherever. And when you were awarded the post office, that was the post office. It was moved into your house. So he served 2 terms as postmaster from 1885 until 1889, and then again a second term in the 1893 to 1897. Now this was a heck of a time to be postmaster because that was the dates of the Limmatye-Slabtown feud. So he was postmaster during that time. So here's 2 articles that I turned up. This one is describing the beginning of the conflict. The post office was a point of contention. The water system was another point of contention. But he was postmaster at this time, and he came up with a solution. He was a slab-towner. He had his business on the west side of the river. And so since he had his drugstore over there, that's where he had the post boxes over there in his drugstore. So he said, okay, I've got a plan. I'm going to build a little letterbox at the west end of the bridge, and you can come to the edge of the bridge without, you don't even have to come into Slabtown. You can get your mail. I'll have my wife there. She'll give you your mail so you don't have to even come into Slabtown. So that was his solution. Well, that didn't really satisfy the Limmatye crowd. And when his term came up, there was another person promoted to postmaster. And that was, space in the name. Sherwood. Yes, Mr. Sherwood got the postmaster shop, and so the post office got moved. They kind of slipped it through. They wanted to move the post office 850 feet. And so that it ended up in Knox's hardware store under the cover of darkness or early morning. So it got moved. And so this was in the Eugene paper, and it talked about the terrible twins are feuding again, the quarrelsome twins and their daily toil. When the coup d'etat was known, the air was rent in twain with the malicious and atmosphere that is now a lurid hue. So anyway, spirited times in the 2 towns. So JP was a druggist, the first druggist in town, and this was along River Road, this store. It's no longer existent. I looked carefully at the picture to try to see if I could see him on the porch, but I don't see him that I could pick out. But he not only dealt in drugs, he had oils, varnishes, wallpaper, paints, stationery, and I'm sure sundries and books. So this was down on River Road, which was really Main Street back in the day. So these are just some snippets. He seemed to be, when he wouldn't advertise with full page ads, but he used these, I'm really calling them patent medicines. Here you have find a safe companion in DeWitt's colic and cholera cure. So it was just, these were stock ads, and they would just stick his name on them. Piles. Everybody know what piles are? Hemorrhoids. Piles of people have piles, but DeWitt's witch hazel salve will cure them. cures scalds and burns without the slightest pain. J.P. Currin. So at some point he retired from the business, but one of his competitors was New Era Drugs, and so he took a position with them. After he retired, he came back, and after surveying and had been induced to accept a position as prescription druggist in the New Era drugstore. The many friends and patrons of Mr. Currin will be reminded of the former day when they see him behind the prescription case again, and he being most careful and competent druggist, old and new patrons alike will extend a liberal share of their drug and prescription patronage to the New Era. And this was the only ad I could find that actually he printed out to to sell himself. So I think he was really kind of frugal and tight. He didn't want to spend money on advertising. But do note that he only deals in the purest drugs. And prices are right. This is one of his competitors, Benson Drugs, and they're offering they'll buy back. You assume no risk when you buy Chamberlain's colic, cholera, and diarrhea remedy. Benson Drugs will refund your money if you are not satisfied after using it. It is everywhere admitted the most successful remedy is for the bowel complaints, and the only one that never fails. It is pleasant, safe, and reliable. The papers are full of this type of ads, so I'm sure a lot of that was quackery. But there's also nice little things you discover. This is the OS&E excursion train to the Red Bridge, which was the Currin Bridge. Leaves at 7:30 a.m. and return at 6 p.m. Round trip, 65 cents. And a sawmill for sale. So this is the 1898 Sanborn fire map. These were made for insurance purposes, so they could later, if something burned down, you could say what it was that burned down. So it's a great historical research. So let me give you an orientation. It says Main Street. This is River Road. This is River Road, and this is going to what we consider Main Street. This at the time was called Wall Street, but this is West Main today. This store is still there. It was the Eakin Bristow store, and then it later served as the Masonic Lodge. And JP's store is right there, and that's what's now the Main Street Market, I think. Either that or Sunshine Store, one of those two. But he advertised in all kinds of stuff. It's listed here as drugs and stationery, 1898. And this is from the 1899 City Directory. I love the fact that the store is scientifically arranged and provided with all conveniences. Conducted with marketability according to modern ideas, and it may be said sustains its high reputation for pure drugs, medicines, and chemicals, also paints, oils, wallpaper, etc., of the best make. The prescription laboratory is well equipped, and every care and attention is given in compounding and dispensing of medicines. So another business venture that they did was dry goods. This notice is given in 1904 that the Griffin and Veatch hardware store is the Lewis and Veatch store is there. He's selling out, and Lewis is selling out, and Currin is taking over. And at the very bottom, this says the end of their association, about 1907. Due to poor health, he has sold his interest to Mr. Veach. So here's an ad for Buster Brown shoes for 1905, best for the money. Here's some other ads from their association. Tablets for school. Hot cakes are ready, but better if you get syrup. They had groceries, dry goods, clothing, boots, and shoes. Griffin and Veach was, I guess, the hardware company. Guns, ammunition, Hercules powder, caps, and fuses. Hercules powder is the way you can say dynamite and get away with it. So JP was a churchman as well, and on the table, I'm a member of First Presbyterian Church, which is a very old church, and this was on the shelf, and I opened it up. It's a hymnal, and on the flyleaf, it's J.P. Currin, so I was very touched to find that. So if you'd like to come see a piece of history, there it is. So the First Presbyterian Church, as it's known today, was known then as the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And they got organized out on the Currin land claim at the Currin School, which is right by the Currin Railroad Bridge, under an old oak tree. And they first met on the first Sabbath in July, which was July 1st of 1855. And this on the right is a picture of the sanctuary that was used from 1892 until 1951. It's where the credit union is today. Notice how high the steps are. Quite a few steps to get up there. That was in the days of the flooding, so it was good to have your building up so you didn't get inundated with water. Today's sanctuary is it's on the historic registry from the renowned architect Pietro Belluschi. And you're welcome to come any Sunday from 10 to 12 and be in this historic architectural wonder and participate in our services. So the old oak is still there that was next to the schoolhouse, and it's there in the church. We maintain a mission fund called the Old Oak Tree Fund, and the congregation used to go out for a reunion picnic under the old oak. This wasn't written on the day of, but it was afterwards recomposed who was at that first meeting, and it's kind of like a who's who of Cottage Grove. The Oglesby, there's John and Margaret Currin, a small Harvey Claiborne Veach, and Circuit Minister Samuel Dillard. So many of the first families of Cottage Grove were Cumberland Presbyterians. JP officially joined in 1893. There he is, and his wife Malia. Lula joined. I never found a record for Hugh. Here he was serving as clerk of the session, temporary clerk, and that was, I think, in 1890-something, 95, 90, 91. So a churchman as well. Lula, his daughter, was very active in the congregation. Robert McClary Veach, this was the second Cottage Grover that graduated in that first OSU class. And these guys, Veach and Currin, were lifelong buddies. I mean, they went to school together. They were neighbors down on River Road. They did a lot of stuff in politics together. They were on the school board together. They were lifelong buds. They ran as a ticket together. On this one here is when he was on the school director. They had 172 scholars, and they realized the school was inadequate. So that big white frame building, that's the one they were talking about. So they voted a new modern school and put up $4,000 to get it done. Here's the Democratic campaign. Mayor Veach and J.P. Currin went to Eugene to attend the Democratic County Committee meeting. This is when they won the election. I believe this was their taxpayer ticket. Mayor-elect Veach. This was a nephew of his, Oliver Orville Veach, and J.P. Currin and Dr. George Wall, who Wall Street was named for, were inducted as counselors. First, here's their mayor-elect, here's his platform. First, the alleys and streets of the city will be cleaned up. Second, the saloon licenses will be increased from $400 to $800 per year. Third, the city will be provided with a sewer system so far as practical, at least a system covering the main streets. So up to that point, it was outdoor toilets or outhouses, and those had fouled the wells, necessitating a freshwater system because the groundwater was polluted. And in those days, that was no joke. Cholera kills. So here's Robert M. Veach as a younger man. After going to OSU, he went to U of O, went to law school, taught school. He was mayor 3 times here in Cottage Grove. He was elected to the Oregon House, where he served for 4 years, and then 8 years as a senator. He married JP's cousin. This was from the George side, Serfina. And this is his house that's still standing. Unfortunately, she never got to see that because politics killed her. He got measles when he was in the legislature, and she nursed him and got measles. He survived, but she didn't. So she died at age 40. Measles. But that's how close they were that he married her cousin. The Veach House is still standing. I believe that was constructed in 1894 and is still standing. But he moved there after she had died. So this is some more politics. Again, the Democratic Party was Southern by even though Oregon as a whole was a Republican state, there was many people from the South that came here, and they were invertebrate Democrats. Here's the taxpayer's ticket. That's with running Veach as mayor, and JP was for councilman. They just had 3 wards at that time. That's a nephew to Robert M. Veach. And this is the one that we saw that swept the election, and we're going to clean up the town and get those saloons under control. And this was the headline for this story, a very lively city election. They had 3 tickets or slates. They had the law and order ticket, they had the businessman's ticket, and they had the citizen's ticket. And the citizen's ticket pretty much prevailed. JP wasn't in the election this time, but Robert Veach got elected mayor. this is a good thing. It was at that time the Democrats were known as Romanism and rebellion because they tended to be drinkers. They tended to be Roman Catholic, a lot of Irish particularly, and they were tended to be Southerners and had participated in the Civil War. All right, so now we get to talk about the Swinging Bridge. I've talked a lot about J.P. Currin. How are we doing for time? Okay, good. So there's a lot of good pictures here, so it won't be a problem. So before the bridge, to get across, they just make a summer crossing, put down some planks, and that would be good. J.P. built a bridge in 1900. It's not where it is today. It was above the rapids. But this is, you can see the rocks. That's kind of a landmark. Here's the first Currin's footbridge. So again, upstream of the rapids. He owned property on both sides of the river. So this connected his property, and that's what that little news story said, that he was connecting both sides of his river. Here's just another view of the same bridge. It was kind of a local tourist attraction. Another view. This says from the bridge, but I don't believe it was. So I believe it was a real estate development ploy, the reason he built the bridge. This ad was in the 1901 paper. Says Currin Park Principality within the city limits, consisting of 7 acres on the bank of the Coast Fork, an ideal pleasure resort or building spot, splendid grove, expensive new footbridge spanning the river, the most available place for a public park. That's what he hoped for. No takers apparently, even at $2,600. So Currin Park was surveyed, recorded. This is First Street, Quincy, and Van Buren. So these are built on now, and Currin Park is just a neighborhood. So rot happened. This wasn't a covered bridge. It was an open bridge, wood truss bridge. It didn't swing at all, but it did rot. So there was a series of stories over the years. Unsafe and closed. The chairman of the street committee was looking into it, said it could be repaired. Committee reported nothing done towards progress. Finally, open again. Finally, they got tired of rotten bridges, so they said in 1917, okay, we got to fix this. So the 17 version, they decided to go with a suspension bridge. And they figured less maintenance, and that's the time they moved it to the new location where it still is today. So the bridge moved in 1917 down the river and got installed as a suspension bridge. And here is the first suspension bridge. It's just 2 taut cables and some handrails, no overhead cables. So this one really could get going. You probably didn't notice, but that first image was reversed. This is really how it is. The giveaway was the utility poles on this side of the river. So this is a picture I found in the files. It said Sicker 1920. I believe it was a picture of that bridge, that no overhead cable bridge. And a lot of old timers talk about missing planks and looking out for falling through that bridge. That original bridge lasted, so it did. There was only a few minor repairs made on that bridge, but in 1945, somebody cut the bridge as a Halloween prank. And I heard that story anecdotally. I was researching the Swinging Bridge, and somebody goes, "They cut the bridge on Halloween." And I finally found it and heard a lot of other stories as well about some guys trying to get away from the cops, went across on their motorcycle across the Swinging Bridge and ditched the cops too. So a lot of Swinging Bridge stories. They offered a reward of $100 for whoever did it. I never found any record that anybody claimed the reward, or for that matter, that the bridge was rebuilt. I figured that would be big news, but at that time there was a lot of wire news, very little local news in the early Sentinels of that time. But this was the first note of Swinging Bridge in the press. This was a lady complaining, Ms. Burkholder, which we're in a Burkholder building right now. She said, whoever been cutting out my wire switches probably used the same wire cutters to cut down the Swinging Bridge. And that's the first time I've heard it called the Swinging Bridge. Usually up to that point it was known as the Currin Footbridge or just the Footbridge. So we had a number 3 bridge. The first one was the wooden truss. The second one was this first suspension bridge. This is the third bridge, and this was taken out by the Christmas flood with the help of a few neighborhood kids. So the Christmas flood, we had a hard freeze, we had a big snow dump, we had a Pineapple Express, and all that combined to do massive flooding throughout Oregon, Washington, parts of Idaho, and Northern California. Some kids, the bridge was still there, but they were bouncing it on the floodwaters, and they got it a little too deep, and the river grabbed it and snatched it away. Luckily, all 3 survived, and I do know their names. This is the only other actual picture I could find of that bridge, and that is, again, after the flood. Now, there's a neighbor that lives across the street, Nola Nelson, grew up going across this bridge, and she made a picture of it while she was in high school. You can probably tell the era by the day-glow colors, but she made a picture of the bridge because she went to school on that every day. And that's the only image that we have of the actual bridge. And I saw Nola here earlier. Are you still here? But anyway, that's the only, hopefully we'll get a real picture someday, but that's the best we could do. And there she is with her picture and the new bridge. 106 years of having a bridge at that location. So 1965 was a time of change for Cottage Grove. The Young Turks came, brought some new energy. We had a new young engineer, Roger Sinclair, who designed the replacement for that bridge that got washed away. There he is in the back. There's Larry Rice, city manager, Carl Rich, Hal McCall. Chuck Massar was the public works director. Roger Sinclair, and the guy in the middle, that's Les Coiner. He was the old guy. He knew everything, but he was getting replaced by the Young Turks. Here's Roger at the controls of the sewage treatment plant, and there's Governor Tom McCall drinking some of the effluent. That was part of the program to get the All-American City, was that we've got this state-of-the-art sewage system treatment. So he's slugging it back. And there's another picture of Roger, and again standing in front of his sewage treatment plant. He tragically got cancer and died fairly young. But he built the new city hall, our city hall, and the sewage treatment plant, and did a lot of great engineering for the city of Cottage Grove. These pictures are from the construction of the bridge before the bridge that we have now. Here's the old tower from that bridge number 3, and they relocated it. Nola said it connected her neighbor's driveway, and it went right by Arthur's front porch. So it's been shifted upstream a little bit. And these are construction during the 1964 replacement bridge. There they are, cutting the decking. These metal brackets are the only part of this bridge that got reincorporated. They used those. They were galvanized and used in the current bridge. This is the Cottage Grove Construction Company doing the work. They poured those abutments. These are the Sinclair kids. It was dedicated during 1965 Bohemia Mining Days celebration, and there's one of the prospectors walking over the bridge. So these are just pictures of that bridge. This is what it looked like when I came. The Swing the Bridge sign is right there. Some of you might recognize it. Do not swing the bridge.
This is drink.
Thank you. This is Sujo's did a painting of it. This became kind of the face of our movement, the Swinging Bridge, Friends of the Swinging Bridge. She printed up postcards. I have a few left. We used the design for our T-shirt, for the poster, anything we did. She was very giving. She lent her talents to so many other causes like Dr. Pierce's Barn, the Carousel, Art Guild. She was a true friend of the Swinging Bridge, never would accept payment for anything. We kept trying to reimburse her for cost, and she never would. So, just wanted to remember her. Again, this is the problem that when you build with wood, rot happens, so unsafe, and that's the sight that greeted me when I came down and was shocked into action. But again, talking to so many people in the process, I heard so many Swinging Bridge stories. People that had their first date, first kiss, marriage parties, high school groups. The football team broke a cable, right, or something. There was all kind of stories. The escape on the motorcycle. One of the events we did to raise money and awareness was Swing the Bridge at the Armory. That night was the first big thing. We raised over $5,000. So the community really loves their bridge. We also got a stack of letters like that, and that was big in getting the grant for the recreational pathways. So in the end, we raised through yard sales, raffles, T-shirt sales, cards. We raised over $18,000, and that was also a good. When we were going for grants, that was also a great thing because it showed community involvement. So that was like we got a $200,000 grant. So just to show you how things have changed, this is the bridge contract for the 1965 version. It's about that thick. And the price to do it was $8,278, 1965. This is the engineer's file on the 2019 project. So quite a bit more involvement, and the price was a few orders of magnitude different. Here's some construction pictures. This guy's name's Tony. He was the boss down there. He's a little guy, but he was tough. And he had all those big guys just jumping. Hamilton Construction was the company, and they built those big bridges over the Willamette in Eugene. They're very well known. They did a design build with the Oz. Can't space and. Anyway, they used steel this time, so there's no rot. The Osland Group. It was a design build. And they did things really smart. They used these lift booms, and they didn't have to use cranes. They could extend out over the river, and they passed the cable, those big cables across the river from boom to boom, and did a lot of really nice. The idea of design build is if the engineer and the builder work together, it'll be cost saving because they'll figure it out and. Oh, well, we should have done that. No, they do it together, and it really saved money and was very elegant to watch the whole thing come together. This bridge did win 2 engineering awards, one for the best public project under $1 million and another one for design excellence. So it's coming together. There's the main cables are up and all the suspenders are down. Almost done. And that was the first, they let me out on the bridge just before they had handed it over. They made me put on a safety desk, and it was very surreal. I couldn't believe it. Because I just was down for the count. I don't know how long this is going to take, but it suddenly happened. And this has some shots for the dedication. This was just too cute not to put in there. That happened on November 30th of 2019. It's hard to remember, to realize that's almost 4 years ago. We had 5 former mayors there, plus the then mayor, Jeff Gowing, and a big crowd of Bridge friends. It was cold. The brownies were there to earn their community celebration. That's ice over there. That's ice, really. Just a sad note, Hal McCall, we got word that he passed away just last week. We had hoped he had been able to come here, but he was there, spoke many words. He was essential in recruiting Roger Sinclair to come to Cottage Grove. He made allusions there might have been some whiskey involved. But he served as mayor and a longtime counselor, and we were going to miss Hal. He had a lot of great stories about Cottage Grove. And that's Susan Sinclair, Christian's, Roger's daughter. And there's the big snip, the moment we were waiting on. The bridge is open. It actually had a soft opening. They let people out on it, and probably one of the first groups across was the Cottage Grove cross-country team. So here's just some odds and ends kind of towards wrapping things up. This is JP and Malia's son, Hugh Currin. He was a U of O graduate. He became an electrical engineer, did a lot of work up in Alaska, all around, and ended up being the eWeb chief engineer. So there's he as a young man and as an older gentleman. They named a substation in Eugene. I know it's not the greatest image. Hugh Currin Substation. They're reworking that one now, but I did check with eWeb, and it will still be called the Currin Substation. Here's a humorous thing from a society page about Hugh. A picnic party of 8 young people spent a delightful day Sunday at Silk Creek Canyon. The young ladies of the party prepared a dainty lunch for the occasion, which was enjoyed immensely. Hugh Currin, one of the gentlemen of the party, is reported to have been the hero of the day. He leaped into the mad waters of Silk Creek and recovered an orange that was accidentally dropped into the stream by one of the ladies present. And there is young Hugh with his parents. They had one daughter, Mabel. He married Mabel McCoy when he was up in Alaska working as a power plant operator. They had 2 sons. When Flora was their only child. I did talk to one descendant that said they adopted a child, but I wasn't able to verify that. There was no mention made. Apparently they were estranged if that did happen. Anyway, they had 2 sons. I spoke with one who's still living, but he apparently didn't want much contact, so I emailed him a lot of information. He said he didn't know much about his family, so I sent him a lot of research that I had done, and I called him a few times and emailed him a few times, but he never got back to me again. I did talk to him once briefly. He did allude to his brother who had passed, and he seems to be a very interesting person. He got into computer gaming. He did all kind of design work for games. It sounded like the Currin creativity streak followed down through him. And he changed his name to Hara Ra, and also to Harry Corazon shortly before his death. He ended up in a cryogenic freezing thing to preserve his brain. So his brother was he's mentioned his brother, but I could tell there was some tension. He said that this guy had a son, but he was also estranged from him. So there still may be a living direct descendant of J.P. Currin. So Felix Currin this is one of the DLC, John Currin's son. He was one of the few surviving children of them. A very successful farmer and very well respected locally. This was his brother, JP's brother, John Wadsworth and Elizabeth Currin. Lula is buried next to them. The Winds, I live in Winds Addition. This was the first doctor that came to Cottage Grove. He is the brother of JP's mother. His wife is the sister of JP's wife. So you got all that? There was a lot of cousin stuff going on in those days. So Wynn's Addition is south of Main Street, west of 4th Street, and he owned, I think, 16 acres that he divided up. He missed the locust trees from his home. He wrote home and said, send some seeds. They did, and they planted a locust grove. And when his daughter, married in Eakin, gave the land to build the Presbyterian church, it was on the condition that those locust trees stay. They mostly have, although we've lost some to age and ice storms and that sort of thing, but there's still locusts along Adams Avenue in front of the Presbyterian church from the wind. And there's their tombstone in Shield Cemetery. They had one daughter born, their firstborn daughter. She lived to be 2 years, 3 months, and 10 days, and diphtheria got her. Most of the Cottage Grove Currins are buried in the Shields Cemetery, which you've never been to. You really ought to go. It crosses over where you go under the freeway at about 18th Street and go up, and it goes a long, windy path. It's a real who's who of Cottage Grove. There's Mosby's, there's Shields, there's Currins, there's Whites, there's Coolies, there's just about it's fascinating. So, and you can still get a place there too if you're looking for your final resting place. There, it's an active cemetery. There's Malia and James Polk's tombstone, and Cora's buried next to them. Lula, their daughter, never married. She was the old maid school teacher, and she doesn't even have a tombstone. She has a little marker. So I have some bridge stuff if you want to get some and leave a donation. If you don't want to leave a donation and still get some, you can do that. But I'm starting, my next project is get a tombstone for Lula. Recently, the Rotary Club got a grant to put up a historical kiosk, so a lot of the information that I found out went on that. Alice Christensen is with us today. She did the beautiful graphic design, and also on the other side, she did the whole thing on Slabtown, which is really informative and beautifully done, and she had to put up with me. And Al helped on the woodwork. That's why it turned out so great. Currins are still all around us. This is off Row River Road, the Currin Connector and Currin Boulevard. We got 2 Currin bridges, and there's still some Currins among us, even though many have moved away. And just a big shout out for all the people connected to the movement.